Have you ever felt like you were disappearing? Like your edges were blurring, fading into the gray around you? That was me on October 23rd. Rain lashed the windows of the little cottage I'd rented for the off-season in Havens Point, Maine. A desperate attempt to outrun the quiet. The quiet that had swallowed my life whole since Mom passed 6 months before. The cottage smelled faintly of damp wool, old wood smoke, and the salt tang blowing in hard from the Atlantic. Outside, the world was a watercolor painting gone wrong, slate sky bleeding into churning steel gray sea, the skeletal fingers of bare maples clawing at the wind. Everything felt muffled, distant, like I was watching my own life through rain-streaked glass. My name is Alara. Or at least, it used to be someone who felt like Alara. Now I was just a woman in borrowed space, surrounded by unpacked boxes filled with a life I didn't recognize anymore. Mom's sudden stroke had left a hole not just in my heart, but in the very fabric of my days. My job as a freelance illustrator felt meaningless. Friends' voices on the phone sounded tinny, miles away. I'd come to this lonely stretch of coast, this shuttered summer town, because its emptiness mirrored mine. Maybe, I'd thought foolishly, I could learn to breathe underwater here. I was trying to sketch the storm from the porch that afternoon, huddled under the overhang, the wind snatching at the pages of my pad. The charcoal smudged under my numb fingers. Nothing felt right. The lines wouldn't hold. Everything blurred. Just like me. I remember the crushing weight of it, the guilt for not seeing Mom's decline sooner, the hollow ache of her absence in the small rituals, the terrifying question, who am I without her anchor? Tears pricked hot behind my eyes, lost instantly in the spray whipped up from the crashing waves below the bluff. I closed the sketchpad. Pointless. That's when I saw him. Not a dramatic entrance. Not a meow. Just presence. A shadow detaching itself from the deeper gloom beneath the sagging porch steps. Just eyes first. Wide, unblinking pools of liquid amber in the downpour's gloom. Fixed on me. Not scared, exactly. Not aggressive. Just intensely there. Watching. I froze. He didn't move. He was a study in muted browns and grays, a thick, once handsome tabby coat now matted with mud and salt, plastered wetly against a frame that spoke of too many lean winters. Big. Or maybe he just seemed big hunkered down like that, low to the soaked ground. One ear had a distinct notch, a ragged tear healed long ago into a badge of survival. But it was his stillness that got me. Utterly motionless. Not even a shiver against the biting wind. Just those eyes, holding mine with an unnerving depth. He looked ancient, weathered, like driftwood tossed ashore by a forgotten storm. "Hey," I whispered, the sound snatched away by the wind. "It's okay." He didn't flinch, didn't blink, just kept watching. The rain plastered strands of fur across his broad forehead. He looked exhausted, beyond exhausted, resigned. I slowly reached for the half-eaten sandwich on the wicker table beside me. Ham and cheese. Not cat food. But it was all I had. I broke off a small piece, held it out tentatively towards the edge of the porch, my arms stretching into the rain. Water instantly soaked my sleeve. He didn't rush. Didn't even twitch a whisker for a long, suspended moment. Then, with a deliberation that felt monumental, he unfolded himself. Slowly, joints perhaps stiff with cold. He took one step, then another. Not towards the food, but closer to the base of the porch steps, still sheltered. He stopped. Lifted his head, sniffed the air, nostrils flaring slightly. His gaze never left my face. There was no trust there, only a profound, weary assessment. Finally, after what felt like minutes, he padded silently up the first 2 wooden steps. Close enough now that I could see the intricate pattern of his tabby stripes beneath the grime, the way his fur was thinner over prominent shoulder blades. He stopped again, just out of arm's reach. His eyes flicked to the offered morsel, then back to my eyes. A silent question hung heavy in the wet air. That's when I saw it, half tucked beneath the thick, wet fur of his neck. Frayed, stained leather. A collar, or what was left of one. It looked impossibly old, cracked and darkened with age and weather. And hanging from it, a small, rectangular metal tag, tarnished almost black. But one corner was bent sharply back, torn, as if caught violently on something long ago. Through the grime and the distortion, a single, deeply engraved letter caught the weak afternoon light filtering through the storm clouds. My breath hitched. A collar. A tag. This wasn't just a stray. This was someone's cat. A name lost to time and neglect? Or ripped away? The torn tag felt like a wound. A silent story screaming from his neck. He took another step, closing the distance. Not to take the food from my hand. Instead, he lowered his massive head slowly, cautiously, and sniffed the rain-slicked toe of my worn sneaker. A long, deep inhale, as if memorizing my scent. Then he lifted his head, those impossible amber eyes locking onto mine again. A slow, deliberate blink. Just once. Something fragile shifted inside my chest. A tiny crack in the ice that had encased me for months. It wasn't warmth, not yet. It was recognition. A shared weight of loss, perhaps? Or simply the shock of being truly seen by another living creature for the first time since the world went gray. Here was this battered, ancient warrior of the storm, collar torn, name obscured, standing in the rain, looking at me like I was the mystery, like I was the one adrift. The wind howled, shaking the porch railing. Rain drummed a frantic rhythm on the roof. But in that suspended moment, under the dripping eaves, there was just the 2 of us. A woman fading into grief. A cat carrying the ghost of a name on a torn tag. The vast, indifferent ocean roared behind us. He didn't take the food. He just stood there, looking, as if waiting for me to decide what happened next. The cold seeped through my clothes, but I couldn't move. The weight of his gaze, the silent question of that torn M, the sheer, weary dignity of him. It pinned me there. Slowly, almost without conscious thought, I lowered my hand, letting the bit of sandwich fall onto the wet wood of the step between us. He glanced at it, then back at me. Another slow blink. Then, with a grace that belied his ragged appearance, he lowered himself onto his haunches, tucking his large paws neatly beneath him, right there on the step. He wasn't coming in. Not yet. But he wasn't leaving either. He was staying, watching the rain, watching me. And in that quiet, rain-lashed space, something infinitesimal changed. A door in my heart, long rusted shut, creaked open, just a fraction. Not hope, not joy, but a startled awareness. A sense that the empty shore I'd stranded myself on might not be entirely empty after all. The storm raged on, but the first fragile thread of a connection, impossibly, had been spun, anchored by a torn tag and a pair of ancient, knowing eyes. The quiet shift had begun. The rain didn't stop for 3 days. It hammered the roof, streamed down the windows, turning the world beyond the porch into a blurred, gray watercolor wash. The wind moaned around the eaves, a constant, mournful counterpoint to the drumming on the shingles. Inside, the damp seemed to seep into everything, the worn sofa cushions, the wool blanket I kept wrapped around my shoulders, even the pages of my abandoned sketchpad felt limp and cold. And outside, on the top step just under the overhang, he stayed. I named him M, silently. Just that single letter from the torn tag. It felt respectful, somehow. Not presuming to give him a whole new name when he clearly carried the weight of an old one. Like a question mark. Like a secret half-told. He was a creature of profound stillness and quiet observation. He didn't meow. Not once. His communication was in the tilt of his head, the intensity of his amber gaze, the subtle shift of his weight. He'd watch me move around the small living area visible from the door, his eyes tracking me from the rain-lashed gloom of the porch. I'd bring out a bowl of water, another offering of whatever human food I could spare. Tuna from a can, bits of leftover chicken, a saucer of milk warmed slightly on the stove. He'd wait until I retreated back inside, the screen door clicking shut, before he'd approach. Slowly, deliberately, always pausing to sniff the air, to assess the distance, before dipping his head to eat or drink with a quiet, almost elegant precision. His fur, once thick and matted, began to dry in patches where the rain couldn't reach him. The underlying tabby pattern emerged more clearly, swirls of charcoal and ash, like storm clouds captured on his coat. The notched ear gave him a permanently skeptical expression. But it was his eyes that held me. They weren't the vacant stare of a feral cat. They were old eyes. Knowing eyes. They watched the crashing waves below the bluff with a weary familiarity, then would swing back to me, holding my gaze with an unnerving directness. It felt personal. Like he wasn't just seeing a human offering food, but me. Ilara, adrift in her own ocean of grief. My grief was a heavy, sodden cloak I couldn't take off. Mom's absence wasn't just an empty chair. It was the silence where her laughter used to be. It was the unanswered question hanging in the air when I saw something beautiful she'd have loved. It was the crushing weight of unsaid things. The apologies for rushed phone calls, the regrets for not visiting more often in those last busy years. The stroke had been swift, merciless. One day planning a garden visit over the phone, the next gone. The unfinished sketch of her hands, strong and capable even in her 70s, lay buried under other papers on the small kitchen table. I couldn't look at it. The guilt was a physical ache, a stone lodged high in my chest. I'd come to Haven's Point to vanish, to let the gray sea absorb the sharp edges of my pain. Instead, I felt more exposed, more raw, under the watchful gaze of this rain-soaked cat. M's personality unfolded like a tightly furled bud in slow motion. He was deeply cautious, yet possessed a quiet dignity that bordered on stubbornness. He wouldn't be hurried. He wouldn't be lured closer than he deemed safe. He accepted the offerings, but on his own terms, in his own time. He spent hours simply sitting, facing the stormy sea, utterly still except for the occasional slow blink. He seemed contemplative, like a weathered sailor staring out at a familiar, treacherous horizon. The sensory world narrowed to the cottage and the porch. The smell of damp wool and wood smoke mingled with the sharp, clean tang of salt air forced in by the wind. The rhythmic crash of waves against the rocks below was a constant, grounding heartbeat. Inside, the tick of the old mantel clock on the bookshelf marked time passing in a life that felt suspended. And then there was M. One afternoon, desperate for a connection that didn't feel like shouting into the void, I dragged the old rocking chair just inside the open front door. I wrapped myself in the blanket and sat, sketchpad abandoned on my lap, a mug of lukewarm tea forgotten in my hands. I just watched him. The way the rain beaded on the drier patches of his fur. The slow rise and fall of his breathing beneath his ribs. The way his ears, one whole, one notched, twitched minutely at the cry of a distant gull lost in the gray. He turned his head, sensing my shift in focus. Those amber eyes met mine. Then, slowly, deliberately, he closed his eyes. Not a blink. A long, slow closing. Holding them shut for a count of 3, then opening them again, gazing steadily back at me. I'd read about this. The slow blink. Cat language for trust. For, I feel safe with you. A lump formed in my throat, unexpected and sharp. In the vast, echoing silence of my grief, this small, silent gesture felt like a lifeline thrown across a chasm. It wasn't grand. It wasn't loud. It was a whisper. But it landed with the force of a shout in the quiet room. "Hi, I whispered back, my voice thick. I tried my own slow blink. Ridiculous, maybe. But necessary. He didn't look away. Just watched. Then he shifted his weight, turning his body slightly more towards the open door, towards me. It was a subtle movement, but it felt significant. Like he was opening a fraction more. The next day, the rain eased to a persistent drizzle. The wind dropped, leaving the air heavy and wet. I brought out his bowl of tuna, placing it on the now familiar spot on the top step. He emerged from his sheltered corner beneath the steps, padding up silently. He ate, his movements economical, efficient. When he finished, he didn't immediately retreat. Instead, he sat back on his haunches, licking a paw with fastidious care, then smoothing it over his face, cleaning around his eyes, his notched ear. The mundane act felt intimate, a glimpse into his private world. He finished his ablutions and looked at me. Then he did something new. He stretched. Not a casual stretch, but a long, luxurious, full-body extension. Front legs pushed out far ahead, claws flexing briefly against the wet wood, back arched high, tail held straight out behind him. He held the pose for a moment, a picture of feline grace momentarily overriding his ragged appearance. Then he relaxed, shook himself slightly, sending a fine mist of water droplets into the air. And then he took a single step over the threshold. Just one paw. Inside the doorway. Onto the worn rag rug just inside the cottage. He stopped there, perfectly balanced, half in the damp world of the porch, half in the dry, quiet world of the cottage. His head swiveled, taking in the small space, the sofa, the fireplace, the cluttered kitchen table, the bookshelves laden with forgotten summer novels. His nostrils flared, sampling the interior scents. Wood smoke, dust, my own lingering smell of tea and wool and sadness. My heart hammered against my ribs. I stayed perfectly still in the rocking chair, barely breathing. He didn't look at me. His focus was entirely on the space, on the smells, on the feel of the dry rug beneath his one forward paw. He stood like that for a long, tense minute. The only sound was the drip, drip, drip of water from the eaves outside and the distant, muffled roar of the sea. Then, with infinite slowness, he withdrew the paw, stepped back fully onto the porch. He sat down again, just outside the door, facing the sea once more. As if nothing had happened. As if he hadn't just tested the boundary between our worlds. But something had happened. That single step over the threshold wasn't just about curiosity. It felt like a question. A tentative exploration of possibility. My carefully constructed isolation, my self-imposed exile within the cottage walls, suddenly felt permeable, fragile. He hadn't entered, but he had considered it. He had acknowledged the space where I existed, not just the food I offered from its edge. That night, the storm finally broke. The clouds shredded like wet tissue paper, revealing a vast, black sky salted with cold, brilliant stars. The wind died completely, leaving an eerie, profound silence broken only by the relentless sigh and crash of the waves. The air turned sharp and crystalline, bitingly cold. I lay on the lumpy sofa, wrapped in my blanket, staring at the dying embers in the fireplace. The quiet inside the cottage felt louder than the storm ever had. The weight of Mom's absence pressed down, a physical thing in the dark. Tears welled, hot and silent, spilling over onto the scratchy wool. The guilt surged, the last argument about nothing important, the birthday card I'd sent late, the 1,000 little ways I'd failed her. The loneliness was a vast, cold ocean, and I was drowning in it. A soft sound at the door. Not a scratch. Not a meow. Just the faintest whisper of movement on the wooden porch. I held my breath, listening. Silence. Then it came again. A soft shuffling sound. Very close to the door. Slowly, silently, I slid off the sofa and crept to the window beside the door. Peering through the glass, blurred slightly by condensation, I saw him. M wasn't sitting facing the sea. He was lying down, curled tightly in a comma shape, right up against the bottom of the door. His back was pressed against the wood, his head tucked towards his chest, his thick tail wrapped around his body for warmth. He was asleep, or trying to sleep, right there, sheltered by the overhang, but exposed to the biting cold of the clear night. He was sleeping against my door. The tears came harder, silent sobs shaking my shoulders. But this time, it wasn't just grief. It was something else. A profound, bewildering sense of being chosen. In his own silent, cautious way, this battered creature had moved closer. He hadn't entered the house, but he had chosen the fragile shelter of my threshold. He had placed his trust, his vulnerable sleeping body, against the barrier separating him from my world of warmth. I sank down to the floor, my back against the wall beside the door, mirroring his position on the other side. The cold would seep through my sweater. I wrapped my arms around my knees, listening to the rhythmic sigh of the sea and the faint, almost imperceptible sound of M's breathing just inches away through the thin wood. The vast loneliness didn't vanish. The grief didn't magically lift. But curled there on the floor, separated from this ancient, mysterious cat by only a slab of pine, I didn't feel entirely alone in the darkness anymore. The quiet shift in my heart deepened, anchored now not just by a torn tag, but by the silent, trusting weight of a creature sleeping against my door. The fragile thread of connection had quietly, unexpectedly, become a lifeline. The cold snap held. M's presence against the door became as much a part of the cottage's nighttime rhythm as the sighing sea. He'd arrive sometime after dark, a silent shadow coalescing on the porch, and curl into his comma shape, pressed tight against the wood. I'd often sit on the floor inside, my back against the wall, sometimes sketching by candlelight, sometimes just listening to the faint sound of his breathing mingling with the waves. We existed in parallel, separated by inches of pine, bound by an unspoken pact of shared solitude. He still wouldn't come fully inside. The threshold remained a potent barrier, but the trust deepened wordlessly. His routine solidified. Dawn would find him gone, presumably hunting or patrolling his damp territory. Around mid-morning, he'd reappear, usually sitting on the top step, watching the gray ocean, waiting. I'd bring food and water. He'd eat with his usual deliberate care, then often retreat to a dry patch beneath the steps for a long, watchful nap. In the afternoons, as the weak winter light began to fade, he'd become more present. He'd sit near the open door if the rain held off, or just inside the threshold if the wind was particularly bitter, observing my movements within the cottage. I'd started sketching him. Tentatively at first, quick charcoal studies capturing the angle of his notched ear, the intense focus in his amber eyes, the way the light caught the intricate patterns of his drying fur. It felt like relearning a language. My hands, stiff with disuse and grief, began to loosen. The lines held. They captured something of his essence, the weary dignity, the ancient watchfulness. Sketching him felt like a form of prayer, a silent communion. He seemed to understand. He'd often sit very still during these sessions, his gaze fixed not on me, but on some middle distance, as if posing for a portrait only he could fully envision. One raw afternoon, the sky the color of bruised pewter, I decided to light a fire. The damp chill had seeped deep into my bones, mirroring the internal chill I couldn't shake. The cottage had an old stone fireplace I hadn't used yet. I gathered kindling and logs from the stack under the porch, the wood damp but serviceable. M watched intently from his spot just inside the doorway as I crumpled newspaper, arranged the sticks, struck a match. The flame caught, hesitant at first, then gaining confidence, licking hungrily at the dry bark, casting dancing orange light onto the worn hearth rug. The moment the fire truly took hold, crackling and spitting, sending its first wave of blessed warmth into the room. M reacted. It wasn't fear. It wasn't curiosity. It was something else entirely. He stood up rigid. Every muscle in his rangy frame seemed locked. His head snapped towards the fireplace, not at the flames themselves, but at the stone wall beside it. The wall where the hearth met the older plaster of the cottage's original structure. His amber eyes, usually so deeply calm, widened. Not with alarm, but with an intensity that bordered on recognition, shock. His tail, usually held low or wrapped neatly, lashed once, a sharp, involuntary movement. Then a sound. Low, guttural. Not a growl, not a meow. A rumble deep in his chest, vibrating the air. It was a sound I'd never heard from him. Primal. Distressed. M. I whispered, crouching near the hearth, my hand instinctively hovering near the flames. What is it? It's just fire. Warmth. He ignored me. His entire focus was locked on that section of stone wall beside the fireplace. He took a hesitant step forward, then another, moving deeper into the cottage than he ever had before. He stopped about 3 feet from the wall, his body still rigid, his head lowered slightly, neck stretched out. He sniffed the air, not towards the fire, but directly at the stones. That low, unsettling rumble continued, a constant vibration beneath the crackle of the flames. He stared, unblinking, as if he could see something etched into the stone, something invisible to me. The firelight flickered in his wide pupils, making them look like molten gold. Minutes stretched. The warmth began to seep into the room, a counterpoint to the sudden chill his strange behavior sent down my spine. He didn't move. He just stared and rumbled. Finally, he turned his head slowly, deliberately, and looked directly at me. The intensity in his gaze was staggering. It wasn't pleading. It wasn't accusatory. It was expectant, as if he was waiting for me to understand what he saw, what he sensed in that unremarkable patch of wall. Then, with a final, almost dismissive flick of his notched ear, he turned and walked silently back to the doorway. He didn't go outside. He sat just over the threshold, his back to me now, facing the sea, but the rigid line of his shoulders spoke volumes. The connection felt severed, replaced by a heavy, unanswered question hanging in the suddenly oppressive warmth of the room. That was the first night he didn't sleep against the door. He was gone when I woke. A hollow feeling replaced the fragile warmth his nighttime presence had brought. The fire incident unsettled me deeply. It wasn't just odd cat behavior, it felt loaded, charged with an emotion I couldn't name. Curiosity warred with a strange, creeping unease. What had he seen? Or remembered? The stone wall beside the fireplace looked utterly ordinary, rough-hewn granite, darkened by decades of smoke, indistinguishable from the rest of the hearth. I ran my fingers over it. Cold, solid, unyielding, just stone. But M's reaction wasn't ordinary. It was a fissure in the quiet understanding we'd built. He returned the next day, acting as if nothing had happened. Ate his tuna. Sat watching the sea. But I noticed a new tension in him. A restlessness beneath the stillness. And he avoided looking towards the fireplace corner. Then, 2 nights later, it happened again. I was reading by the weak light of a table lamp, trying to lose myself in someone else's story, when I heard it. A soft, persistent sound. Not the wind. Not the sea. Scritch, scritch, scritch. I froze, the book forgotten in my lap. The sound was coming from the living room. From near the fireplace. Slowly, silently, I rose and crept to the doorway. The fire was low, just embers glowing. The room was mostly dark, but I could see him. M was standing before that same section of stone wall beside the hearth. He wasn't staring this time. He was scratching. Not violently, not like a cat trying to sharpen claws. It was deliberate, focused, methodical. Using one front paw, claws extended just enough to catch on the rough stone surface. Scritch, scritch, scritch. He'd scratch a few times in the same spot, pause, sniff the stone intently, then scratch again. A low, almost inaudible hum vibrated in his chest, different from the distressed rumble before. This sounded concentrated, intent. My breath caught. This wasn't random. This was a pattern, an obsession. He was fixated on that specific patch of wall. But what did he sense there that I couldn't? Was it a smell trapped in the stone? A memory encoded in the mortar? The torn tag around his neck suddenly felt heavier, more significant. What secrets was carrying? What history was embedded in these old cottage walls? I didn't interrupt him. I watched, a knot of apprehension tightening in my stomach. He worked for maybe 10 minutes, utterly absorbed, before suddenly stopping. He sniffed the spot one last time, then turned and padded silently back to the porch, disappearing into the night without a backward glance. The next day, driven by a growing unease and insatiable curiosity, I decided to investigate the wall myself. Properly. I got a flashlight, a step stool. I examined every inch of the stonework beside the fireplace. I tapped. I pressed. I ran my fingers over every crevice, every slightly protruding stone. Nothing felt loose. Nothing sounded hollow. It was just wall. Solid, cold, impenetrable granite. Frustration warred with a strange sense of dread. Was M losing it? Was the harsh life finally catching up to him? Or was there something here, something hidden, that only he could perceive? The scratching became a nightly ritual. Always around the same time. Always the same spot. Scritch, scritch, scritch. It became the soundtrack to my deepening anxiety. The sound wormed its way into my dreams. I'd wake in the dark, heart pounding, convinced I could still hear it. The cottage, once a refuge, now felt charged with a subtle, growing tension. The mystery of M, the mystery of the wall, intertwined with my own unresolved grief, creating a low thrum of disquiet beneath the surface of our days. My isolation, once chosen, now felt like a trap. I needed perspective. I needed to know more about this place, this cottage. Maybe about the cat who seemed bound to it by invisible threads. Havens Point in winter was a ghost town. The few year-round residents were a closed book, weathered faces nodding curtly but offering little conversation. The library was only open 2 afternoons a week. I went, feeling like an interloper in the small, overheated room smelling of old paper and dust. The librarian, a woman with kind eyes behind thick glasses named Mrs. Gable, was the first person I'd spoken to beyond a muttered, "Hello," in weeks. "I'm renting the old Henderson place," I said, my voice sounding rusty from disuse. "Down on Sea Spray Lane. I was wondering, do you have any local history books? Or maybe records about the cottage?" Mrs. Gable peered at me. "The Henderson place? Oh, that old cottage has seen some years. The Hendersons only owned it since the late 70s, dear. Before that..." She tapped a finger against her chin. "Before that, I believe it was the Merriweather family. Lived there a long time. Quite a while back now." She shuffled towards a shelf of thick, leather-bound volumes. "Our archives are sparse. Mostly summer colony gossip and lobster catch records." She pulled out a heavy book titled Havens Point, Tide and Time. "This might have something. Property transfers, perhaps." She handed it to me. "Not much on individual houses, I'm afraid." I spent an hour poring over the dense, faded script. I found a mention of the property on Sea Spray Lane being sold to a J. Henderson in 1978. Before that, nothing specific. Just vague references to older fishing families. No mention of Merriweather. Frustrated, I closed the book. The name nagged at me. Merriweather. It felt familiar, but I couldn't place why. On the walk back, the cold air sharp in my lungs, I passed the only open store, a cluttered general store that sold everything from fishing tackle to milk. Old Ben, the proprietor, was sweeping salt grit off the worn wooden steps. He nodded as I approached. "Cold enough for ya?" he rasped. "Freezing," I agreed, pausing. "Ben, you know that cottage down on Sea Spray? The one with the blue shutters, bit run down." He leaned on his broom, squinting at me. Henderson Place. You're the one renting it? Brave soul wintering down there. Bleak. I was wondering, before the Hendersons? Someone mentioned Merriweathers? Ben's expression shifted. A shudder seemed to come down over his weathered face. He looked away, towards the churning gray harbor. Merriweathers. Long time ago. His voice was flat. "Do you remember them? Remember of them?" He started sweeping again, more vigorously. "Keepin' to themselves mostly. Tragedy there." He stopped sweeping abruptly and looked directly at me, his eyes sharp. "That cat still hanging around?" The question startled me. "Cat? Big old tabby. Tough-looking fella. Notched ear." Ben's gaze was piercing. "Seen him skulking near your place. That's their cat." "But this long time ago. Belonged to the boy." Ice water seemed to trickle down my spine. "Their cat? The boy? The Merriweather boy?" Ben nodded once, curtly. Name was Merlin, I think. Fanciful name. Cat was devoted to that boy. Went everywhere with him. Till he trailed off, shaking his head. "Bad business. Long time ago. Best leave it buried." He turned and walked back into the store, the bell jangling sharply behind him. The conversation was over. I stood frozen on the sidewalk, the cold suddenly biting deeper. Merlin. The torn tag. Merlin. The name echoed in the hollow space left by Ben's abrupt departure. Bad business. Tragedy. The words hung in the frigid air, heavy with implication. The boarded-up house across the street flashed into my mind, the one M stared at with such unnerving intensity. Was that the Merriweather house? The walk back to the cottage felt longer, the gray sky pressing down. M was waiting on the top step as usual. He watched me approach, his amber eyes unreadable. But as I drew closer, unlocking the door, I saw his gaze flicker past me, towards the boarded-up house. Just for a second. A confirmation. I stepped inside, the familiar smells of damp wool and wood smoke now tinged with a new, chilling layer of mystery. M didn't follow immediately. He sat on the step, facing the sea, but his posture was different. Tense. Watchful. Not resting. Guarding? The scratching on the wall took on a terrifying new dimension. It wasn't just strange behavior. It was a link. A cat named Merlin, scratching obsessively at a wall in a cottage connected to his long-lost boy, and a tragedy no one wanted to speak of. The quiet trust we'd built felt fragile suddenly, stretched thin over a chasm of decades-old pain and secrets. The torn tag wasn't just a relic. It was a key. And the wall held something M needed to uncover. Or something he couldn't forget. That night, the scritch began again, puncturing the silence. Louder, perhaps? Or was it just my heightened awareness? I lay on the sofa, wrapped in my blanket, staring into the darkness where the sound emanated. The warmth of the cottage couldn't reach the cold dread pooling in my stomach. The connection had shifted, irrevocably. It was no longer just about shared solitude. It was about stepping into a story that began long before I arrived. A story etched in grief and hidden behind a stone wall. M wasn't just a cat seeking shelter. He was a ghost from a buried past, scratching insistently at the door of the present. And I, adrift in my own sea of loss, suddenly found myself caught in the riptide of his. The question wasn't just why he scratched. The question was, what was he trying to reach? The tension wasn't just rising. It had become the very air we breathed. The fragile peace shattered, replaced by the insistent, unanswered echo of claws on stone. The scritch became the heartbeat of the cottage. A relentless, unsettling metronome counting down the hours of darkness. It wasn't just sound, it was vibration. It seeped into the floorboards, up through the soles of my feet when I stood frozen in the hallway, listening. It echoed in the hollow spaces left by my own grief, amplifying the dread Ben's cryptic words had planted. Their cat. The boy. Bad business. Sleep became impossible. Each night, I'd lie rigid on the sofa, the blanket pulled tight around my chin, staring into the firelit gloom of the living room doorway. Waiting for it. Dreading it. When it began, usually around midnight, a cold sweat would prickle my skin. I'd imagine Merlin out there, his worn claws scraping against the unyielding granite, driven by a memory or an instinct I couldn't fathom. Was he trying to dig? To reach something? Or was it a futile ritual, a ghostly echo of a trauma trapped in his ancient feline mind? The days were no better. M still came for food, still sat watching the sea, but the quiet companionship was gone, replaced by a palpable tension. He'd eat quickly, warily, his ears constantly swiveling, his gaze flicking towards the boarded-up house across the lane or back towards the cottage door. He avoided the fireplace corner entirely during daylight, giving it a wide berth as if the stones radiated cold. His amber eyes, when they met mine, held a new depth of something. Not fear, exactly. Anticipation? A desperate urgency I could feel humming beneath his stillness. My grief for Mom became tangled with this new, suffocating mystery. The unfinished sketch of her hands lay untouched, but now it was joined by frantic, half-formed charcoal drawings of that section of wall. I'd sketched the rough texture, the shadows, trying to see what he saw. Trying to find the flaw, the seam, the hidden thing. The guilt I carried, for missed moments with Mom, for words unsaid, morphed into a different kind of guilt. Guilt for disturbing whatever peace this place held. Guilt for being an intruder in Merlin's decades-long vigil. And beneath it all, a terrifying pull, the need to know. The cold intensified. A brutal nor'easter blew in, howling around the cottage like a banshee, driving stinging pellets of ice against the windows. The power flickered, died, plunging the cottage into a darkness only broken by the guttering light of the fire I kept burning constantly now, more for psychological comfort than actual warmth against the invasive chill. The storm mirrored the turmoil inside. The scratching stopped during the worst of the wind, even Merlin sought deeper shelter. But the silence felt heavier, more ominous. On the third night of the storm, the wind dropped suddenly, leaving an eerie, pressurized quiet. The fire burned low, casting long, dancing shadows. Exhaustion pulled at me, a physical weight. I must have dozed off on the sofa. A sound jolted me awake. Not scratching. A thud. Solid. Heavy. From the living room. My heart leapt into my throat. Adrenaline burned through the fatigue. I sat bolt upright, clutching the blanket. The firelight was faint, but enough to see the outline of the doorway. Silence stretched, thick and expectant. Then a low, rumbling sound. Not distress this time. Deeper. More guttural. Almost a growl, but softer. A sound of intense effort. I slid off the sofa, my bare feet silent on the cold floorboards. Every nerve screamed. I crept to the doorway, pressing myself against the jamb, peering slowly around the corner. Merlin stood before the wall. But he wasn't scratching. He was braced, his powerful front legs planted wide, his shoulder muscles bunched and straining under his thick winter coat. His head was down, pressed against a specific stone, a slightly darker, flatter piece near the bottom corner of the hearth. He was pushing, shoving his full weight against it with a low, continuous grunt of exertion. His claws were out, digging into the mortar for purchase. The thud I'd heard must have been him ramming it with his shoulder. He paused, breathing hard, sides heaving. He sniffed frantically at the stone, then renewed his efforts, throwing his weight again. The sound echoed in the quiet room. Dust sifted down from the mortar above. He was trying to move it. The realization hit me like a physical blow. This wasn't random scratching. This was purposeful, deliberate. He knew something was behind that specific stone. The decades-old mystery, Ben's ominous words, the torn tag with its single letter, it all coalesced into a terrifying, undeniable certainty. Merlin wasn't haunted. He was hunting. Hunting for something lost behind that wall. Fear warred with a desperate, rising compulsion. I couldn't stand by. I couldn't let this ancient cat exhaust himself against unyielding stone. The secret wasn't his alone anymore. It had become ours. Our shared burden of loss, separated by years but bound by this cottage, this wall. "Merlin," I whispered, stepping fully into the room. He froze instantly. His head snapped up, amber eyes blazing in the firelight, fixing on me. not with surprise, but with a fierce, almost challenging intensity. As if he'd been waiting for me, expecting me. The low rumble in his chest continued, a vibration I could feel in the floorboards. I walked towards him slowly, my heart hammering against my ribs. The air crackled with tension. He didn't move, didn't retreat. He just watched me, his gaze unwavering, his body still braced against the stone. It felt like crossing a sacred threshold. I knelt beside him, the cold stone biting through my thin pajama pants. Up close, I could see the stone he was fixated on. It was different, slightly recessed, or maybe just worn smoother on the edges. The mortar around it looked older, more crumbly than elsewhere. Merlin watched me, his breath hot and rapid near my hand. He nudged the stone with his nose, a silent command, then looked back at me, that expectant intensity radiating from him. He needed my hands. The implications were terrifying. What if it was nothing? What if it was something horrific? What if I disturbed a grave, literal or metaphorical? But the look in his eyes, it wasn't madness. It was memory. It was loyalty. It was a grief as deep and ancient as the stones themselves. Taking a shuddering breath, I reached out. My fingers, cold and trembling, traced the edge of the stone. I pressed. Nothing. I pushed. It felt immovable. Merlin made a soft, urgent sound deep in his throat. He pressed his own shoulder against the stone again, demonstrating. I needed leverage. I stood, scanning the dim room. My eyes fell on the heavy iron poker leaning against the hearth. An instrument of violation. My stomach churned. But Merlin's gaze held mine, insistent, pleading in a way no meow ever could. Grabbing the poker felt like picking up a weapon. I returned, kneeling again. I wedged the tapered end into the crack between the suspect stone and its neighbor. Merlin watched, utterly still now, his entire being focused on the point of contact. I took another breath, braced my feet, and pushed down on the poker with all my weight. A grating sound. Harsh. Unnatural in the quiet. A shower of ancient mortar dust fell. The stone shifted. Just a fraction. An inch. But it moved. Merlin made a sound unlike any I'd ever heard. A choked gasp. A whimper, vibrating with pure, raw emotion. He shoved his nose desperately into the newly revealed gap, sniffing frantically, whining low in his throat. Adrenaline surged, overriding fear. I repositioned the poker, pushed again. Harder. The stone grated, shifted another inch, then suddenly tilted inward. It wasn't mortared on that side. It was a plug. A heavy, camouflaged plug set into the wall. It fell inward with a dull, final thud, disappearing into blackness. A wave of cold, stale air rushed out, smelling of damp earth, decay, and something else, something faintly sweet and metallic. Merlin didn't hesitate. He shoved his head and shoulders into the dark hole the stone had left, wriggling with frantic determination. His hind legs scrabbled for purchase. He was going in. Merlin, wait. Panic seized me. What was in there? Rats? Collapsing earth? I grabbed the flashlight I'd kept nearby since my own investigation. Clicking it on, I aimed the beam into the hole. The light fell not on earth, but on a small, cramped space behind the hearthstones. A hidden cavity. And Merlin was halfway in, his back end still visible, his tail lashing. He was digging, frantically, pushing loose dirt and small stones back between his legs with his front paws. Then he stopped, utterly still. A low, mournful sound began to emanate from the hole. A sound of pure, unadulterated grief. a feline keening that seemed to rise from the very bedrock of the cottage. It filled the room, vibrating in my bones, echoing the vast emptiness of my own loss. Tears streamed down my face, hot and fast. I knew. Even before I saw, I knew. "Merlin," I whispered, my voice breaking. "Come out. Please. Let me see." Slowly, painfully, he backed out of the hole. He was covered in fine gray dust. He didn't look at me. He sat beside the opening, head hanging low, his sides heaving, that terrible keening reduced to a ragged, broken panting. He looked utterly defeated, devastated. Shaking so hard I could barely hold the light steady, I pointed the beam into the cavity. At first, just disturbed earth. Then the beam caught something else. Something small. Curved. The bone. A small, delicate human finger bone. Time stopped. The roaring in my ears drowned out the sigh of the sea. The cold air rushing from the hole felt like the breath of the grave. I stared, unable to process, unable to breathe. The beam shifted slightly, catching more fragments. Fragments of tiny ribs. A curve of skull, unnervingly small. He hadn't been scratching at a memory. He'd been scratching at a tomb. A hidden, terrible tomb behind the hearth. The Merryweather boy. Ben's bad business. The tragedy no one spoke of. The flashlight clattered from my numb fingers, plunging the corner into near darkness, lit only by the dying fire's embers. A sob ripped from my throat, raw and guttural. Not just horror. Recognition. Profound, shattering grief. I saw Mom in that instant. Not her death, but her life, her fierce love, the unbearable thought of losing a child, the unimaginable pain the Merryweathers must have carried. The secret they'd walled up with their sorrow. I crumpled forward, my forehead pressing against the cold, gritty stone floor beside the open hole. Sobs racked my body, violent and uncontrollable. Months of pent-up grief for Mom, the shock, the horror, the overwhelming sadness for the lost boy and his broken family, it all erupted. I cried for the boy trapped in the dark. I cried for Merlin, waiting decades, knowing, remembering. I cried for Mom. I cried until my throat was raw and my eyes burned, the taste of salt and dust thick on my lips. A warm weight pressed against my side. Merlin. He didn't nuzzle. He didn't purr. He simply lay down beside me, his dusty flank pressed tight against my trembling arm. His head rested on the floor near mine, his breath warm and steady against my temple. His keening had stopped. He was utterly silent, still, just present, sharing the weight of the unbearable. In that moment, the mirror was absolute. His ancient grief, a decades-long vigil for his lost boy. My raw, fresh grief for my lost mother. Two souls shattered by loss, huddled together on a cold stone floor before an open grave. The barrier between human and animal, between past and present, dissolved. We were simply broken. Together. He lifted his head slightly. Not to look at the hole. To look at me. His amber eyes, reflecting the faint ember glow, held no judgment. No demand. Only a profound, shared sorrow. And something else. A flicker of weary acknowledgement. A silent, "You see now." His massive paw, dusty and worn, lifted slowly. Not to touch the bones. To rest it gently, heavily, on my forearm where it lay on the floor. A touch of solidarity. Of shared burden. A gesture of immense, wordless comfort from one grieving soul to another. It was the most powerful expression of love I'd ever felt, silent, heavy with shared pain, and utterly unconditional. The storm outside was nothing compared to the tempest that had just broken within the cottage walls. The secret was out. The truth, horrifying and heartbreaking, lay exposed. But in the devastating aftermath, curled on the floor with a cat who had carried the weight of this truth for a lifetime, I felt something else pierce the suffocating grief. Not peace, not healing, but a raw, fragile connection forged in the darkest depths of loss. The scratching had stopped. The wall had spoken, and the echo would resonate forever. The climax wasn't just revelation. It was the shattering of two hearts and the silent, dusty touch that held the pieces together. The silence after the storm wasn't peaceful. It was hollow. The cavity in the wall gaped like a wound in the cottage's very soul, exhaling the cold, stale breath of decades. The tiny bones, fragments of unthinkable loss, lay exposed in the beam of the flashlight that had rolled to a stop against the baseboard. The world had shrunk to the circle of weak light, the scent of disturbed earth and time, the crushing weight pressing down on my chest where I lay crumpled on the cold stone floor. Merlin's flank was a solid, warm line against my arm. His breathing, steady and deep now, was the only anchor in the vertigo of horror and grief. That single, heavy paw resting on my forearm wasn't just comfort. It was an unbreakable tether holding me to this unbearable reality. We stayed like that for a long time, suspended in the aftermath. No tears came now, just a profound, shivering numbness. The keening inside me had stopped, replaced by a vast, echoing silence. Eventually, the practical part of my brain, the part that had navigated funeral arrangements and emptied my mother's apartment, began to surface through the shock. It felt alien, almost disrespectful, to think of what next while kneeling before the remains of a child. But the cavity was open. The truth was exposed. It couldn't be ignored. It couldn't be sealed back up. Slowly, carefully, I sat up. Merlin lifted his head, watching me, his amber eyes reflecting the dying ember light. They held no judgment, only a deep, weary sadness and a question. Well, I have to. My voice was a raw scrape in the silence. I have to call someone, Merlin. I have to tell them. The thought of involving the police, of strangers trampling through this sacred, terrible space, felt like another violation. But burying this secret again was unthinkable. The Merriweather boy deserved his name back. His story deserved an ending, however tragic. Merlin didn't move. He just watched as I pushed myself stiffly to my feet, my legs trembling. I avoided looking directly into the cavity. The image of that small, white curve was seared onto my retinas. I picked up the flashlight, its beam shaking in my hand, and pointed it deliberately away from the hole, towards the phone on the small table in the hallway. Making the call was surreal, explaining to the calm, professional voice of the Havens Point dispatcher that I'd found human remains behind a wall in my rented cottage. The disbelief on the other end was palpable, then replaced by urgent questions. Was I safe? Was anyone else there? I answered mechanically, my gaze fixed on Merlin. He had risen too, sitting upright beside the open cavity, facing the hallway, his posture alert, watchful, guarding the threshold, guarding the secret that was secret no more. The wait for the police was agonizing. The cottage felt like a crime scene, which, of course, it was. A decades-old crime scene. I paced the small living room, unable to sit, unable to look at the hearth. Merlin remained near the opening, a silent sentinel. His stillness was different now. Not the weary resignation of the storm watcher, nor the obsessive tension of the scratcher. It was resolved. A vigil fulfilled, even if the outcome was devastating. He occasionally glanced at the cavity, not with frantic energy, but with a profound, quiet sorrow. He'd done what he'd come to do. He'd found his boy. The arrival of the police shattered the fragile silence. Flashing blue lights strobed through the windows, casting eerie, moving shadows. Heavy boots on the porch. Knocks. Voices. Merlin tensed, a low growl rumbling in his chest for the first time since that first night by the fire. I opened the door, feeling like I was betraying him, betraying the sanctity of the grief we'd shared. 2 officers, their faces grim and serious in the porch light, entered. Their professionalism was a buffer against the raw emotion churning inside me. I showed them the cavity, my explanation halting, fragmented. I mentioned the cat, his history, Ben's cryptic words. They listened, asked questions, their flashlights probing the dark space, their expressions tightening as the reality sank in. They secured the scene, called for detectives, a medical examiner. The cottage filled with people, equipment, the murmur of official voices, the crackle of radios. The air grew thick with the scent of coffee, damp wool, and the lingering, unsettling smell of the cavity. Through it all, Merlin watched. He retreated to the farthest corner of the living room, beneath the window overlooking the sea, pressing himself low to the floor. His eyes, wide and wary, tracked every movement, every stranger invading this space that had become his sanctuary, his mission field. He didn't hiss. He didn't flee. He just observed, radiating a potent mixture of distrust and profound exhaustion. When a detective tried to approach him, he simply turned his head away, staring fixedly out at the dark ocean, his body rigid. They left him alone. I was questioned repeatedly. My story. How I found the cottage. The cat. The scratching. Mrs. Gable at the library. I repeated it, each recitation feeling like peeling off a layer of skin. The detectives were respectful but thorough, their eyes missing nothing. My grief for my mother felt exposed, tangled up in this older, darker tragedy. I felt like an intruder, a catalyst who had disturbed a grave. At some point, during the long, surreal night, I made coffee. Mechanically, offering cups to the officers standing watch. The mundane act felt jarring. As I stood in the small kitchen, the familiar smells of coffee grounds and damp would momentarily overriding the other scents, my eyes fell on the kitchen table. Underneath a pile of unopened mail lay the unfinished sketch of my mother's hands. I hadn't looked at it since I arrived. A detective was nearby, making notes. The hum of activity continued in the living room. But in that small pocket of kitchen stillness, I reached out. My fingers, still dusty from the floor, brushed the edge of the sketch pad. Slowly, I pulled it out. The charcoal lines were smudged from being buried, but the image was clear. My mother's hands, capable, veined with age, holding a trowel, ready to plant something. I remembered the day I'd started it, sitting in her sunny kitchen. She'd been embarrassed. "Oh, draw something pretty, Alara, not these old things." A sob caught in my throat, sudden and sharp. Not just for Mom. For the Merriweather mother. What had her hands looked like? Had they planted flowers? Held her son? Clutched in despair when he vanished? The parallels were crushing. The universal language of maternal love and loss, spoken across decades. A warm pressure against my leg. I looked down. Merlin had silently padded into the kitchen. He didn't look up at me. He sat beside my leg, leaning his weight gently against my calf. A quiet solidarity. An acknowledgement of the shared pain resonating in that simple sketch. He understood. He'd always understood loss. The forensic team arrived just before dawn. Their presence was clinical, detached. They carefully documented the cavity, the bones, the surrounding area. Watching them work, treating this intimate, horrific discovery with sterile procedure, felt necessary but deeply jarring. They sealed the area. The remains were carefully removed, placed in a plain, respectful container. A somber procession left the cottage as the first gray light of a new day seeped through the windows. The police finally left, promising updates, asking me to stay available. The cottage door closed behind the last officer. The sudden silence was deafening. The blue lights were gone. The voices, the radios, the intrusive presence vanished. Only the sigh of the sea remained, and the gaping, boarded-up cavity in the wall where the stone had been removed for evidence. Covered now with heavy plywood secured by the police, it was a stark, ugly patch on the old stonework. A visible scar. I stood in the center of the living room, adrift. The cottage felt simultaneously empty and crowded with ghosts. The weight of the night pressed down, a physical exhaustion seeping into my bones. I turned slowly. Merlin was sitting in the middle of the room, where the rug met the stone floor. He was looking directly at me. Not at the boarded-up hole. At me. His amber eyes held a new depth. The frantic urgency was gone. The obsessive tension dissolved. There was a profound weariness, yes, etched deeper into the lines of his face. But also a quietness. A stillness that wasn't resignation, but something like acceptance? Release? The decades-long burden of knowing, of remembering, of seeking, it had been lifted. The truth was out. His vigil, in its most desperate form, was over. He blinked slowly. Then he stood, not with his usual deliberate grace, but with a slight stiffness, as if the night's vigil had taken a physical toll. He walked towards me, stopping a foot away. He didn't rub against my legs. He didn't meow. He simply sat down again, looking up at me. Then, deliberately, he lowered his massive head and rested his chin gently on the toe of my worn sneaker. A gesture of utter trust, of companionship, of shared survival. The dam broke. Tears I hadn't been able to shed before the police, tears held back by shock and procedure, flooded out. Silent, hot streams coursing down my face. I sank to my knees on the rug, not caring about the dust. Merlin didn't move his head. He kept his chin resting lightly on my shoe, a grounding weight as I cried for the lost boy, for his parents, for Merlin's long loneliness, for my mother, for the sheer, unbearable weight of grief in the world. I cried until my eyes were swollen, my head throbbed, and the gray light outside had strengthened to a pale, washed-out morning. When the tears finally subsided, leaving me hollowed out but strangely lighter, I looked down. Merlin lifted his head, meeting my gaze. His eyes held no expectation, just a quiet, steady presence. The connection hadn't been severed by the horror, it had been reforged in its crucible. Stronger, deeper, tempered by shared sorrow. Life began to move forward, irrevocably changed. The police investigation unfolded slowly, a grim puzzle reassembled from fragments of memory and old records. The Merriweather boy's name was confirmed. Michael. A childhood accident, covered up in a moment of panic by a terrified parent? Something darker? The town's whispers grew louder, then hushed again, respecting the tragedy's long shadow. Ben wouldn't meet my eyes at the store. Mrs. Gable at the library offered a sad, knowing nod. The boarded-up house across the lane seemed to sag further under the weight of its revealed history. Within the cottage, routines shifted. The hearth felt haunted, even boarded up. I couldn't bring myself to light a fire there. I bought a small electric heater, its impersonal hum a poor substitute for the crackle of wood. Merlin's behavior transformed. The nightly porch vigil ceased entirely. He no longer slept pressed against the door. Instead, he began to come inside. Fully. Tentatively at first, exploring corners he'd previously ignored, sniffing bookshelves, investigating the kitchen cabinets. He'd choose a spot, sometimes the rag rug near the cold hearth, though never too close to the patched wall, sometimes the sun-warmed patch on the sofa if the weak winter light broke through, sometimes simply the floor near wherever I was working. He still spent hours gazing out at the sea, his profile etched against the window, but the intensity had softened. It was observation now, not a vigil. He'd often seek me out. Not demanding attention, but simply being near. He'd curl up beside the rocking chair while I tried to sketch. Not him, not yet, but the sea, the gulls, the patterns of frost on the window pane. My hands were steadier. The lines flowed again, capturing the world outside, the world moving forward. He'd blink slowly at me, a silent approval. One afternoon, I was attempting a sketch of the boarded-up cavity, trying to capture the starkness of the plywood against the ancient stone. It felt important, somehow. Necessary. Merlin was asleep on the sofa. As my charcoal scratched the paper, he stirred. He stretched languidly, yawned wide, then padded silently over. He sat beside my chair, watching my hand move for a moment. Then he didn't settle at my feet. He stood, placed his two front paws gently on the arm of the rocking chair, and nudged my sketchpad with his nose. A soft, insistent push downward. I lowered the pad. He looked at the sketch of the patched wall, then up at me. He made a soft sound, a quiet MRP, deep in his throat. Then, deliberately, he turned his head. Away from the sketchpad. Away from the boarded-up scar. He looked instead towards the kitchen window, where the pale afternoon light was catching the edge of my mother's teacup sitting on the counter, a cup I'd finally unpacked and washed that morning. He looked back at me, held my gaze, and blinked slowly. The message was clear. Look forward. Look at life. Not just at the wound. A quiet sob caught in my chest, but this time it was laced with something like gratitude. I closed the sketchpad. I put the charcoal down. I reached out, slowly, and ran my fingers through the thick fur on his head, scratching gently behind his notched ear. He leaned into the touch, a low, rumbling purr starting in his chest. It was the first time he'd ever truly accepted physical affection. It vibrated through my fingertips, warm and alive. A sound not of the past, but of the present. A fragile, hard-won peace. The mystery wasn't solved, not fully. The grief for Michael, for Mom, for all the losses carried silently, would never truly vanish. But the crushing weight had shifted. It was a burden acknowledged, shared, integrated into the fabric of our days. Merlin no longer scratched at walls. He slept peacefully on the sofa. He greeted me at the door when I came back from the store. He purred. The cottage still smelled of damp wool and salt air, but now it also smelled faintly of cat, a warm, dusty, living scent. And sometimes, when the light was just right, and the sea sighed rather than roared, and Merlin lay purring beside me as I sketched the curve of a wave or the intricate pattern of frost, the air didn't feel so heavy. The edges of the world felt a little less blurred. The gray hadn't lifted, but within it, there were moments of warmth, of quiet companionship, of life tentatively moving on. The scar on the wall remained, a permanent reminder. But so did the cat who had led me to it, and who now, in the aftermath, chose to stay. Not out of obligation to the past, but in the quiet, resilient companionship of the present. The connection had survived the breaking point. It was different now. Bruised but enduring, like the sea-smooth stones on the shore below, shaped by the storm, but still there, still whole. Spring arrived on Haven's Point not with a fanfare, but with a slow, stubborn thaw. The brutal grip of winter loosened, replaced by a damp chill that lingered in the shadows but surrendered grudgingly to pale, watery sunlight. The ocean's gray softened to a steely blue-green. Gulls wheeled and cried with renewed purpose. Buds, tiny and defiant, appeared on the skeletal maples. Life was pushing back against the long silence. Inside the cottage, a different kind of thaw was happening. The boarded-up cavity in the stone wall remained, a stark, silent scar. It wasn't ignored, but its power had shifted. It was a fact of the landscape now, like the notch in Merlin's ear, a marker of survival, of pain endured. The electric heater's hum was a constant companion, a poor substitute for the crackling hearth, but warmth was warmth. And Merlin was blooming. The ancient wariness, the decades-deep tension, had melted away like the last stubborn patches of ice in the ditches. He moved through the cottage with a quiet confidence that was new. He claimed spaces. The faded armchair near the window became his chair. The afternoon sunspot on the worn rug was his domain. He'd greet me at the door when I returned from the library or the store, not with meows, but with a slow, deliberate blink and a soft thump of his tail against the floorboards. He'd follow me into the kitchen, sitting regally near the stove while I cooked, his amber eyes half closed in contentment, the tip of his tail twitching faintly. The deep, rumbling purr, once a rare and startling sound, had become a near-constant vibration. It filled the quiet corners, a low, comforting engine of life. He sought touch, not demanding but accepting. He'd brush against my legs as I stood at the sink. He'd curl up beside me on the sofa as I read, his warm weight a grounding presence. He'd rest his chin on my knee as I sketched, watching the charcoal move across the paper with serene interest. Sketching had become my anchor again. I drew the sea in its shifting moods, churning gray, calm turquoise, shimmering silver under the moon. I drew gulls riding the wind, intricate frost patterns on the windows, the brave, tiny crocuses pushing through the muddy earth near the porch steps. And I drew Merlin, capturing the new softness in his eyes, the relaxed drape of his tail, the way the sunlight turned his tabby fur into a tapestry of gold and ash and charcoal. He'd often watch, then offer that slow blink of approval. The sketch of my mother's hands now sat framed on the small mantel above the cold hearth, a quiet tribute facing the boarded-up scar. The police investigation had concluded its grim work. Michael Merriweather's death was officially ruled an accident, a fall, perhaps, hidden by panicked parents consumed by grief and fear, leading to an unspeakable decision. The whispers in Haven's Point faded, replaced by a somber, communal sigh. The boarded-up house across the lane seemed to settle deeper into the earth, a monument to a tragedy finally acknowledged, if not fully understood. My lease was nearing its end. The thought of leaving the cottage, leaving this windswept point where I'd found both shattering loss and unexpected connection, filled me with a complex ache. Where did someone go after a season like this? One damp afternoon, the air thick with the scent of salt and wet earth, I decided it was time. Time to face the last box. The one I'd shoved into the tiny, cold spare bedroom closet the day I arrived, marked simply Mom. I hadn't been able to open it. The grief had been too raw, the cottage walls too thin to hold it. But now, with Merlin's steady presence, with the slow healing that felt less like forgetting and more like integration, I felt a tentative readiness. I pulled the box into the living room, placing it on the rug near the electric heater. Merlin, dozing in his armchair, lifted his head, ears pricked forward, watching with calm curiosity. The cardboard felt flimsy under my fingers. Dust motes danced in the weak sunlight as I lifted the flaps. Inside, it wasn't treasures, but fragments of a life. Her favorite blue cardigan, smelling faintly of lavender, and the cedar balls she tucked into her drawers. A small wooden box containing mismatched buttons saved for decades. A stack of well-thumbed gardening catalogs. Her reading glasses, slightly bent. A collection of smooth stones she'd picked up on beaches over the years. And, nestled among them, a small, cloth-bound photo album. I hadn't seen it in years. My hands trembled as I lifted it out. The fabric was worn soft. I sat cross-legged on the rug, the album heavy in my lap. Merlin stirred. He stretched languidly, then jumped down from his chair with a soft thud. He padded over silently and sat beside me, close enough that his fur brushed my leg. He watched my face, not the album, as if sensing the significance of the moment. I opened it. The first pages held faded snapshots from my childhood, Mom laughing, holding a squirming toddler me on a beach, Dad, younger than I remembered him, grinning beside her, birthday parties with cake-smeared faces. The ache was there, sharp and sweet, but bearable. Merlin leaned his weight gently against my thigh, a warm, silent support. I turned the pages. Pictures of gardens she'd nurtured, friends I barely remembered, holidays long past. Then, towards the back, tucked loosely into the sleeve, not glued down, I found it. A photograph I'd never seen before. Black and white, slightly blurry, the edges curled. It showed a young woman, maybe in her late teens or early 20s. She was standing in what looked like a cottage garden, hollyhocks towering behind her. She had a wide, open smile, her hair caught in a breeze. She was holding a small, wriggling bundle wrapped in a blanket. Not a baby. A kitten. A tiny, striped kitten with huge, curious eyes. The kitten was reaching a minuscule paw towards the woman's laughing face. My breath caught. The woman, there was something familiar in the shape of her eyes, the curve of her smile. I flipped the photo over. Written in faded, looping pencil script, me and Merlin, Havens Point, summer 58. Maggie, not Michael. Maggie Merriweather? Michael's mother? Merlin, the kitten. Her Merlin. Tears welled, hot and sudden. Not just tears for Maggie, frozen in time with her joy, oblivious to the future heartbreak. Tears for the tiny, playful kitten held so gently. For the long, loyal life that stretched out before him, marked by devotion and unimaginable loss. For the thread that connected this moment of pure, uncomplicated love to the battered, ancient cat sitting beside me now, his head tilted as he gazed at the photo in my hands. He made a soft sound. Not a meow. A quiet chirrup, deep in his throat. He leaned closer, his nose inches from the photograph. He sniffed it delicately, not the paper, but the image itself. His whiskers brushed my knuckles. Then, slowly, deliberately, he lifted his head and looked at me. His amber eyes held a depth I hadn't seen before, a softness, a recognition that transcended time. He blinked slowly. Twice. He remembered. He remembered the hands that held him as a kitten. The laughter. The sun-drenched garden. The love. It hadn't all been erased by the darkness that followed. That core of belonging, of being cherished, had remained, buried deep beneath the layers of survival and grief. Seeing the photo, smelling the faint, ghostly scent of decades-old paper and the memory it held, brought it to the surface. It was there, in the liquid softness of his gaze. He didn't look sad. He looked peaceful, acknowledging. He nudged my hand gently with his head, then turned and walked back to his armchair. He jumped up, circled once, and settled down, tucking his paws neatly beneath him. He closed his eyes, his purr starting up again, a soft, steady rumble that filled the quiet room. He wasn't looking at the past anymore. He was simply being, carrying the memory within him, a part of his story, but not the whole story. The gift wasn't just the photo. It was the confirmation. The proof that Merlin's life hadn't been defined solely by loss. That before the tragedy, there had been sunlight and hollyhocks, and a young woman named Maggie who loved a tiny striped kitten named Merlin. It was a fragment of joy preserved, a counterpoint to the sorrow we'd uncovered. It completed the circle, not by erasing the pain, but by restoring the balance of his long life. He hadn't just been Michael's cat. He had been Maggie's first. Loved from the very beginning. I sat on the floor for a long time, the photo held gently in my hands, the album open beside me. The late afternoon sun slanted through the window, warming the rug, catching the dust motes in a golden dance. Merlin slept in his chair, his breathing deep and even, the purr a contented hum. The scent of salt and damp earth drifted in through the slightly open window, mingling with the faint lavender from Mom's cardigan and the warm, dusty scent of the cat. The profound sense of wholeness settled over me. Not happiness, not exactly, but a deep, resonant peace. The jagged edges of the past few months, the shards of grief, for Mom, for Michael, for Maggie, for the Merlin who had carried his burdens so silently for so long, hadn't vanished. But they were no longer raw wounds. They were integrated, part of a larger, more complex tapestry. Seeing Maggie's joy, seeing Merlin as a tiny ball of life held with such tenderness, made the subsequent tragedy feel less like an ending and more like a terrible bend in a very long river. The river kept flowing. Merlin was still here. I was still here. The decision about leaving crystallized in that quiet, sunlit moment. I couldn't stay in the cottage forever, haunted by the scar on the wall and the ghosts of the past. But I wasn't ready to vanish back into the gray anonymity I'd arrived with. Haven's Point, with its bleak beauty and its buried secrets, had cracked me open. It had forced me to confront my grief, not run from it. It had given me Merlin. I looked at the sleeping cat, his notched ear visible against the chair's faded fabric. He'd chosen to stay. He'd chosen me, not just as a provider of food and shelter, but as a companion in the aftermath. He'd shown me that life, however scarred, could hold warmth, purrs, sunlit patches on the floor. That moving forward didn't mean forgetting. It meant carrying the love alongside the loss. The final gift wasn't just the photo of Maggie and kitten Merlin. It was the clarity. I would leave the cottage, but I wouldn't leave Merlin. And I wouldn't leave the person I'd become here, the one who had faced the darkness and found not just survival, but the fragile, resilient capacity to connect again. I carefully placed the photo back into the album sleeve, next to the pictures of Mom. Two mothers. Two lives intertwined through time and a cat. I closed the album, holding it in my lap, feeling the solid weight of memory, of love, of enduring connection. Outside, a gull cried. The seaside. Inside, Merlin purred. The past was present, acknowledged, held gently. The future was an open window, letting in the salt-tinged air of possibility. The gift was the understanding that the next chapter wasn't about escaping the storm, but about learning to sail in its aftermath, with an ancient, notched-eared navigator curled contentedly at my side. The final piece of the mystery wasn't a secret revealed, but a choice made to carry the love forward. The salt-scrubbed cottage stood empty again. Sunlight streamed through the windows I'd left open just a crack, illuminating dust motes dancing where Merlin's purr used to vibrate the air. On the mantel, 2 framed photographs remained, Mom's hands cradling soil and life, and Maggie Merriweather's laughing face tilted toward a kitten whose name would outlive them all. The boarded-up cavity in the stone wall was silent now, a scar acknowledged, but no longer bleeding. Moving day had been quieter than I'd imagined. Not an escape, but a crossing. Merlin watched from his carrier as the last box was loaded into my small car, his amber eyes taking in the cottage, the sea, the boarded-up house across the lane. No tension in his frame. Just observation. Acceptance. When I lifted his carrier, he didn't cry. He blinked slowly at the weathered porch where we'd first met, then turned his gaze to me. Ready. We drove south along the coast, away from the biting winds of Havens Point. The cottage I'd rented was smaller, sunnier, with a garden where neglected rose bushes fought through weeds. It smelled of salt and pine resin, with no ghosts in the walls. Merlin explored every corner that first evening, his tail held high like a banner. When he jumped onto the windowsill overlooking the tangled garden, he didn't stare at the horizon with ancient sorrow. He watched a sparrow hop between branches. His ears twitched. For the first time in decades, perhaps, he saw only the present. The heaviness in my chest didn't vanish. Grief isn't a stone you remove, it's a tide that reshapes your shoreline. Some mornings, I'd wake and reach for the phone to call Mom before remembering. The silence would swell, thick and suffocating. But then Merlin would pad into the room. He'd leap onto the bed, not to comfort, but to demand, a paw batting my cheek until I rose to fill his breakfast bowl. His needs were simple, immediate, anchoring me to the now. He'd started playing. A crumpled paper ball tossed across the floor could occupy him for minutes, his massive frame pouncing with a clumsiness that made me laugh, a sound that still surprised me. One rainy afternoon, I found him sitting before the small bookcase I'd built from driftwood. He was staring at a spine, coastal flora of Maine. I'd packed it from the cottage, a relic of Mom's gardening passion. Merlin looked at me, then back at the book, then nudged it with his nose. A quiet request. I pulled it down, dust flying. Inside, pressed between pages about sea lavender and beach peas, was a photograph I hadn't seen. Mom, maybe 10 years younger, kneeling in a riot of purple lupins. Beside her, beaming, was a woman with wind-tangled hair and familiar eyes. Maggie Merriweather. On the back, in Mom's looping script, Havens Point Garden Society, 95. Maggie and her magic lupins. They'd known each other. The revelation didn't shock me. It felt like a final stitch in a tapestry I'd been weaving blind. 2 women who'd loved the same stubborn coast, the same fierce blooms, the same impossible beauty of things that grow despite the salt and the wind. Had they shared coffee? Complained about aphids? Did Mom know about Maggie's son? The weight behind Maggie's smile? I'd never know. But the connection was there. A thread spun years before Merlin's torn tag caught the light on a stormy porch, years before my own loss sent me north. Merlin nudged my hand, pulling me back. He wasn't interested in the photo. He sniffed the dried lupin petals still clinging to the page, then sneezed. A comical, undignified sound. I laughed, the last knot of loneliness loosening. He blinked at me, unimpressed, then sauntered away to bat a sunbeam on the floor. The message wasn't in grand revelations. It was in the accumulation of small, steadfast things. Grief is not a cage. It's a landscape you learn to walk. Some days are brambles. Some days are open shore. Love outlives memory. Merlin didn't need to remember Maggie's laughter to carry its warmth. It lived in his bones, in his capacity to trust again. We are bridges. Between past and present. Between species. Between strangers who become unexpected family. I started volunteering at the local animal shelter. Not out of guilt, but because Merlin would sprawl across my sketches, blocking the paper until I paid attention. He developed a particular disdain for drawings of empty landscapes. Fill them, his silence seemed to say. So I did. With charcoal lines of rescue dogs with hopeful eyes, kittens curled in blankets, volunteers with tired smiles. Merlin approved. He'd sniff the drawings, then bump his head against my elbow. One evening, as I sketched him sleeping in a patch of late sun, his fur gilded, his notched ear relaxed, I realized the profound gift he'd given me. Not closure, but continuance. He'd shown me that a heart can break and still expand. That new love isn't a betrayal of the old, but its echo. That sometimes, family arrives with a torn tag and amber eyes, refusing to let you disappear into your own sorrow. The cottage in Havens Point was sold. I heard it went to a young couple expecting their first child. They plan to restore the hearth. I hope they do. I hope they fill the rooms with noise and mess and life. I hope they never sense the shadow that once lingered in the stones, or if they do, that they respect its quiet. Merlin's vigil was over. His work was done. Now, he naps in sunbeams. He complains if dinner is late. He watches sparrows with the intensity of a kitten, though his movements are slower, his jumps less sure. Time has etched itself deeper around his eyes. But when he rests his chin on my knee, purring as I sketch the curve of a wave or the arch of a rose coming back to life, the years fall away. In those moments, he's both the kitten in Maggie's arms and the ancient guardian who led me home. Not a ghost. A testament. Life doesn't offer neat endings. Only pauses. Places where the waves recede, leaving treasures in the sand. A smooth piece of sea glass, a perfect shell, the weight of a cat's head on your lap. The sorrow for Mom, for Michael, for Maggie, it's still there. But it's woven into something richer now. A tapestry of survival. A map of scars that say, I loved, I lost, I chose to stay soft anyway. Merlin stirs in his sleep, one paw twitching. Chasing dream sparrows, perhaps. Outside the tide turns. Waves gather, fall, gather again. A rhythm older than grief, older than memory. The light shifts. Gold softens to lavender. Soon, the stars will emerge, distant and constant. I reach down, my fingers sinking into the thick fur behind his notched ear. His purr rumbles back to life, a vibration against my palm. Not a goodbye, a promise. That love endures, not in spite of the scars, but within them. And sometimes, the most extraordinary rescues are the ones that happen quietly, one slow blink, one shared silence, one torn tag at a time. If this story found its way into your heart, please like this video, subscribe to our channel, and hit the bell icon so you never miss a tale of second chances and silent heroes. Share it with someone who believes in the quiet magic of connection. And comment below, we'd love to know, where in the world are you listening from? Your stories remind us that love speaks the same language everywhere. Until next time, hold space for the unexpected. You never know who might arrive at your door, carrying a secret and a key. Goodbye for now.